good afternoon, everyone. It's always unenviable to have the post-lunch session, but we'll be engaging in frivolity and hijinks to entertain you all and get the blood moving again after lunch. And hopefully this is a stimulating conversation, an interesting one. We're talking about the concepts of economic resilience and economic security today with a really preeminent panel. I won't reintroduce them, they've just been introduced to you. But we have a range of regional perspectives from across the Indo-Pacific. We've got a Southeast Asian perspective, an American perspective, a Japanese perspective, and an Australian perspective. And in a moment, I'll ask each of the panellists to give us some of their opening thoughts about the tensions and the trade-offs in this issue and the trends, whether we've come as far as we need to go in putting economic security at the centre of our economic policy making, or whether there's further to go, and whether we've made any mistakes along the way. So I might start, Mike, with you, because all good trends, bad or otherwise, come from the United States. And when it comes to...
So we got that going for us.
And when it comes to putting a security lens on economic policy, certainly the Trump administration led the way with this in a way that's been very much continued and followed by the Biden administration. It seems to be an area of consensus in Washington. So I'm interested first in your high-level perspective. Have we come as far as we need to on these issues? Do we have more work to do, and what are the trade-offs and risks?
Well, I think clearly we have more work to do. Broadly, I just make three kind of opening points, I guess. The first is, when we're thinking about economic resilience, we got to step back and think, remember, this is part of a broader economic security strategy. It's a component of that strategy. And one of the things I think the challenges we're facing now is we are entwining increasingly the concepts of economic security and national security. And we're very much placing a prism of national security around many economic issues that traditionally we wouldn't have necessarily looked at that way. That's not necessarily a terrible thing, but the one caution I would give is I worry at times that we're increasingly thinking about the national security side of things and not as much about the economic side of things. And if we're not careful, we're going to make some choices that we think might generate near-term national security for us, but I think if we're not careful, we're going to undercut our longer-term economic security. The second point I would make really goes to this idea of when we talk about resilience, the world is proving to be, in some ways, a lot more fragile than we thought it was. We've got a lot more single points of vulnerability or failure, a lot more points of friction. And I think we've created a world that in some ways is so complex that we don't fully understand it. I think, for example, in the US, if you had stopped and said, hey, we have one system that moves 45% of all refined gasoline products in the most heavily populated part of our country, from the Gulf area up the East Coast through major cities like Atlanta, Washington, Philadelphia, and into New York City, one provider carries 45% of all the distilled products of gasoline. I think you would have scratched your head and said, so that represents a fairly significant point of vulnerability. What kind of resilience do we have here? And we really didn't get into this until, we had a significant cyber event that led us to actually shut down the pipeline for a while. And the last point that I would make is, if we're not careful, we need to think about risk, but we need to think about opportunity. And at times, I'm a little worried that in the current dynamic, we seem to be very focused on the risk and not as much on opportunity. And I think to get where we collectively want to be, and that doesn't matter if you're a large nation, a small nation, if you're a group of nations, I think collectively we all want to ask ourselves, what are the opportunities that are going to help create that better economic security, that stronger national security, and resilience clearly is going to be one of the components of those strategies.
Thank you. We'll come back to that question of opportunity later, because you're right, it's the underappreciated when we're talking about the risk. Shigeru, what's Japan's perspective on this? Like the United States, like Australia, you're a market-based economy, you've prospered enormously from international trade, but you also face some very serious emerging and imminent national security threats. How are you finding the balance?
As you said, I think the impact of the shift of the US policy is so important to Japanese government. We enacted the Act for the Promotion of the Economic Security in 2022. it is stemming from the influence of the US policy. But first of all, we must recognize the ongoing structural change in the global economy, which has traditionally been driven by globalization with a focus on cost and efficiency. However, this model is evolving, and new guiding principles such as stability, sustainability, and de-risking are emerging. The G7, traditionally a leader in promoting globalization economy, is now recognizing these shifts by issuing an independent statement on economic resilience and economic security for the first time in 2022. This statement covers vital areas like supply chain, critical infrastructure, rulemaking, and response to rampant economic coercion in this region. A notable shift is a move away from a focus on efficiency and cost to one on reducing risk or de-risking. I like to emphasize the growing importance of economic security within the G7, reflecting the broader change in the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Astanah, you've got a background as a diplomat for Malaysia. You now have a senior role at ASEAN. To what extent do ASEAN nations share the perspectives articulated so far from Western countries, quote unquote, about economic security, and to what extent do they disagree?
Thank you. The thing is, ASEAN, it's a collection of 10 nations, mostly 10 relatively small countries with one or two, one big economy and one rich country, two rich countries. So ASEAN has always seen security in a comprehensive manner. And in that sense, economic security, economic prosperity very much forms part of the security perspective that we approach it with. At the same time, I think some of the things happening in the world today sort of drives home the point that closer economic integration is not necessarily a sufficient condition for conflicts to be avoided. We saw that with Russia and Ukraine. So therefore, what is the point we learn from that? That merely closer economic integration in and of itself is not necessarily sufficient. What is also needed is therefore strategic trust and confidence. Now, ASEAN's approach in all things is to be friends to all people, and therefore one of the things, and definitely the Americans know this of ASEAN, is that we do not choose who becomes our friends. Our approach is that everyone is a friend to the region and to the individual members, and this we find to be quite important in all our approaches on every element. Now, of course, it's important for ASEAN that, for us, that the member states must try to be, and insofar as it achieves it, to remain economically resilient, so that the region would be able to withstand and adapt to various challenges and disruptions. One of the key areas that I think ASEAN focuses on is on supply chain resilience, particularly coming out of COVID, or rather what we, all of us faced during COVID was on the supply chain disruption, and therefore increasingly ASEAN is focusing on that. And part of ensuring resilience in this area is to diversify our supply chain, and this is where having friends around the world is particularly important. Also part of that is to protect emerging and critical technologies, which means resilience in this instance would be where we should need to have robust frameworks in order to prevent unauthorized transfer or misuse of technologies, etc. So that's something that we're looking at. We're working with our partners so that our resilience can be increased. And then on the point of de-risking, the perspective ASEAN takes on de-risking is that while it is important to reduce dependencies, we need to also be careful and to keep in mind that it is equally crucial to avoid overcorrection, because that we think would be quite dangerous and where it could lead to isolation and inefficiencies. So that's some of the areas that we're looking at. So for us, the ASEAN approach is that a resilient system does not necessarily seek to eliminate all risks, but rather to manage them in a way which allows for continued growth and cooperation. We accept that that's part of the reality and how we need to deal with it. So that's, I think, the ASEAN approach, that a resilient economic system is one in which we can anticipate, where we withstand and we could recover from shocks while maintaining our core functions for the economy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that point that you made about the role that emerging technology is playing in setting the terms for this emerging policy debate is critical. Mike, I want to come to you on that, given your background and continuing involvement in the tech sector. Obviously, the United States and its allies have recognised that technology competition is going to be a decisive theatre in the contest for the 21st century with China and other authoritarian states. China's got a track record of stealing intellectual property from the West, including Australia. Our ASIO Director General Mike Burgess has publicly assessed that they're by far the largest source of state-backed intellectual property theft. Do you think it's inevitable because of that we are going to end up in a bifurcated tech world, two different polar tech worlds, one led by the United States and one led by China? And whether that's inevitable or not, do you think it's a good thing?
So first of all, not all technologies are the same or have the same economic impacts. So if you look at U.S. policy, for example, it tends, I'm not in the government, but just looking at it, it has tended to focus, the Biden administration has tended to focus on semiconductors as the kind of underpinning, if you will, for a lot of different technologies, but is also now highlighting in policy AI and quantum would be the other two areas I highlight. So the idea that we're going to have a total separation, I don't think is likely, but clearly in some areas of technology. And why is that? Because I think I'll only speak for the United States, and I believe it's the same for China. Our experience is that core technologies offer great economic and national security advantage in the digital economy. And that some of those core technologies are what are going to kind of underpin economic development and your ability to compete. And therefore, the US and other nations are saying, look, we need to make sure, given that importance, that we retain a strong measure of capability, and we also potentially impact others' ability to try to outcompete us. The other challenge that tends to shape US policy, you said in your comment, look, America, the way we are raised, we welcome competition. You are told from the time you were a little person in our society, competition is a good thing. Competition brings out the best, and competition will make you a stronger individual. And I don't mean just stronger physically. It'll make you better able to deal with the world around you. You should embrace competition. The challenge for the US is we always like to think about competition, but on a level playing field. And that's the issue that we have tended to have with China, where we've argued it's not a level playing field with you. You're stealing our intellectual property. You're making it very difficult for our companies to actually operate in your domestic market in a fair and competitive way. And it's those kinds of policies that we're trying to argue are in the best for all of us, not just the US or China, but to make an honest, open, competitive, global-based economy. That's in everybody's best interest.
I just want to test this proposition that you and a lot of representatives of the Biden administration have also advanced, which is we're going to keep this as a relatively limited set of technologies that we're seeking to restrict. It's the Jake Sullivan small garden, high walls concept, but the garden does seem to be getting a little bit bigger. We've now got sanctions on EVs. I think probably for very good reasons, but it's starting to bleed into kind of consumer technologies. Doesn't that suggest that the trend is going to be much broader than just AI and quantum?
The EV policy is driven much less by technology for the US, in my opinion, and much more about just market dynamics in terms of selling material into the US market that is heavily subsidized by the government that is generating it, from the nation that's generating it, therefore potentially providing those companies economic advantage when they're competing against our domestic manufacturers. And the fact that the reality is right now, the United States does not have, by global standards, a significant EV production and technology capability compared to China or compared to Europe, for example. It just hasn't been an area where we have traditionally focused. I will say you do hear this idea of, well, the garden seems to be expanding. The wall seems to be getting higher, but the garden's getting bigger. While I think it's fair to say the garden has expanded a little bit, I don't think, at least for me, I'm yet ready to say, hey, the government wants to broadly say if it's tech, we must severely control it, we must severely limit others' access to it. I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think we're going to go there unless something significant were to change.
Yeah, Shigeru, Japan has a very large car industry, obviously, and is facing that competition from China too. How much are domestic policy considerations and protection of national industries entering into this conversation rather than a pure security lens?
First of all, I must mention about we talked about some linkage between the economic security policy and protectionism. But first of all, it's very important for us to proceed with the two principles. One is the high fence, small yard and high fence, and de-risking. And I like to add another word. I see the minilateralism in order to confront with the rampant economic coercion in this region. It is a critical aspect of the effective international cooperation, particularly in response to the inefficiency of a large organization like the United Nations, WTO, and the Wassenaar Arrangement. The Quad and the trilateral collaboration between Japan, the US, and the Netherlands on semiconductor manufacturing equipment exemplify this concept. Effective international cooperation involves countries with the capability and the willingness to demonstrate their expertise in their respective field, contributing to solving global problems, including the confronting the economic coercion. The small yard high fence strategy, coined by Jake Sullivan, my former counterparts, reflects a targeted approach to economic security. I believe this cooperation should extend to other critical areas, as you mentioned, such as battery, EV, magnet, and rare mineral, among countries like Australia that share democratic values, further enhancing economic cohesion and resilience. Thank you.
Okay, that's something to take up further. Sada, you mentioned the risk of inefficiencies here in governments getting too involved in directing international trade and economic development. ASEAN's been very clear that one of its top priorities for its member states is development. So how concerned are you that these trends will get in the way of the economic development opportunities for your member states?
So if I could just refer earlier to your question to Mike, where
Please.
you were saying if technology were going to develop in a bifurcated way and where things would stand. And I think vis-a-vis ASEAN, if it does happen, and we think that would be rather tragic, but if it does happen, ASEAN approach would be, well, we hope to sort of benefit from all our friends and to be able to work with everyone and offer ourselves up to see how it is that you can work with us, we can work with you, what it is, what role can we fulfill. So that's something that's a way that small countries like ASEAN can find a role for ourselves to play. On the question you asked, and I think to some extent that relates to something that Shigeru had mentioned, which is the development of minilaterals. This is something that ASEAN views with a lot of concern because we think this necessarily takes away from countries being able to work with each other in a way which would be of benefit more globally, simply because ASEAN believes in maintaining an open, rules-based global economy. It's something that initially, when globalization was really becoming a trend, there were many countries in Southeast Asia that was cautioning against the impact, the negative impact it would have. But even as we spoke on it, we worked on the system within our country so that we would be able to benefit from it. So it is something that we raised the caution of it, the specter of the dangers of it, but at the same time we continued working on ourselves so that we would be in a position to benefit from it. Now, minilaterals, I think, is sort of causing some amount of concern that previously, if I could draw a parallel, I think globalization did for us. And the problem with minilaterals is we feel that the world we've all been working towards an open world space system. So now reverting to minilaterals actually takes many of us sort of out of the equation or puts us at a huge disadvantage, because now we've got to find different ways of now trying to work on that. So there is some amount of concern that I think countries within ASEAN has on this development. What ASEAN would generally like and calls for is to look at de-risking more pragmatically, that it doesn't require us moving away from the well-functioning global economy generally that we've built out, but instead we should create a more resilient and more sustainable economic environment, which hopefully benefits pretty much all of us. So that's some of the concerns that we are facing.
I'm interested in that observation about minilaterals. Do you think ASEAN members would view the BRICS, for example, as a minilateral that's been a negative influence as well?
No, BRICS is actually quite different, because in a way you've got G7, etc., and that's something that didn't raise any specter of concern for us. Minilaterals, especially vis-a-vis ASEAN, when we look at minilaterals, was Quad. Because it brought together 4 countries that in a way encircled ASEAN. We fully understand it was not meant against us in any way, but it would have real impact on the economy of our region, and that would absolutely impact on us. So it's not any grouping of countries would be seen as a minilateral. I think there are other elements need to be part of it for us to see it with some amount of concern.
Okay, thank you. In a moment, we'll have some questions from the audience, so start thinking about questions and get ready to raise your hand if you've got one that you want to ask. Mike, you flagged earlier this question of opportunity. You're right, in these conversations, we often talk about risk. What are the downsides? What are the opportunities that come from bringing a security lens to economic and trade policy?
So look at things like cyber is an issue. Every nation in the world is concerned about cybersecurity right now. It doesn't matter if you're large, if you're small, in size, population, economic stature, or level of production. You look at things like humanitarian assistance. You look at, there's so many areas. Even, for example, Jake's session in Beijing last week, even in the midst of the challenges between the United States and China, the United States highlighted fentanyl and drugs, climate, and artificial intelligence. Here's multiple areas where we think, even when we are in the midst of this competition, we do think that there are areas where we actually could cooperate and create opportunity for both our nations as well as the broader world around us. So I think even as we're looking to identify the areas where we have friction, I think we should also be asking ourselves, what are the areas where we actually have the potential for cooperation? We can actually generate positive outcomes that are going to help all of those. And cybersecurity is the one that always comes to mind, in part because of my background and what I did when I was in government. But I just think there's a great dimension there. And one other thing about cybersecurity before I forget, when we talk about resilience, one of the dimensions of resilience in this highly hyper-connected digital world that we live in, to me, is the security of our networks, our data, and our functionality. That when we're thinking about resilience, security becomes a core component of that. And at the moment, I'm watching some governments around the world who, to me, seem to be looking at policy choices through very narrow prisms. And they're not necessarily invalid prisms, but it might be competition, it might be climate, or environmental. And part of my things is, one of the things that we collectively have said to ourselves, whatever we do, we should not compromise safety. We've always generally said safety and the well-being of our publics is such a core responsibility. Make sure whatever you do you don't impact that. Just as a doctor is taught, no matter what happens, do no harm. You're always taught whatever medical choices you make as a physician, do no harm. I wish that we thought about cybersecurity as a core kind of basic about whatever policy choices we're making out there, whether it be in the name of competition or et cetera. Let's make sure whatever we do, we are not undercutting cybersecurity because we are building a global economic model. Doesn't matter how large or how small you are as a country, we are building literally a premise that says hyperconnectivity, massive amounts of data are the future building blocks of economic activity and national security. And we are not walking away from that, even in the midst of these challenges that we're having to deal with.
Rationally, we certainly do have a globally shared interest in cybersecurity and maintaining the rules of the road that everyone abides by. But obviously we know there are many nation states which pay lip service to that, which are either host to criminal gangs, which they know that flourish in their jurisdiction. They do nothing to stop it. In fact, they have their tacit support, and some states engage in very significant state-backed cyber espionage. How can you deal with states which really have only a pretense of those concerns that we share?
Right, so number one, cybersecurity is different from how nations choose to use cyber as a tool. Whether they're a criminal group that is trying to do it to generate revenue, whether it's a nation state that is trying to do it to generate the theft of intellectual property, espionage, et cetera. The first is, and we've been trying collectively for a long time to do this, can we get to a core set of beliefs or a core set of principles that we're going to build our approaches towards cyber around? We haven't really had any success so far in coming to a global consensus on what those core components might be. I used to argue when I was in the US government, when dealing with the president, the two that I worked for, we need to break this down into something smaller and just take this incrementally. Not, hey, here's the 10 commandments, these are the 10 things. Let's break this down into something smaller and build a consensus over time. We have been unable to deter nation states for the choices they make with respect to cyber. That's just the reality. It's not through a lack of effort, but it just hasn't succeeded so far. And then the criminal groups, look, every one of them operates in some defined sovereign territory somewhere, which means the nation state that has responsibility for that sovereignty, in my opinion, has a responsibility to ensure that that is not being misused against others. And yet we have, particularly the Russians and in the East, Eastern Europe, it's not by chance that the largest concentrations of cyber criminals in the world are in Russia and Eastern Europe, because they know the governments have either been unwilling or ineffective in their abilities to attempt to bring them under control.
I just want to cover one more concept before we go to the audience for questions, which is, each of you I think have touched on at some point, diversification or de-risking as an objective for nation states. What we haven't kind of discussed is what the main driver of that is, and one of the big drivers is that we've discovered in recent years that there's some very large states that are willing to use economic coercion against their trading partners. Australia's just coming to the end of a very unpleasant multi-year experience of that, and we wouldn't be talking about diversification or de-risking unless we had had that experience. What can we do to deter and discourage states from entering into those kind of strategies in the first place? What can we do collectively to raise the costs of a country that engages in economic coercion? Shigeru, let's start with you.
First of all, Mike talked about the threat on the cyber domain. I think the actual threat of the cyber domain is very imminent. But concerning the cooperation for the cybersecurity among countries, it's some kind exemplifying the cooperation of the multilateralism. The country who has the capability and the willingness do together something. I think in order to do that, the interoperability is so important, and the deep understanding and the close exchange of information is so important. I think it's a reality of the actual situation. I mentioned about multilateralism. Multilateralism is standing for the dysfunctionment of the large international organization and the large international regime, I think. it will play the role of the complementary role against the dysfunctional large organization. At the same time, I like to underscore the importance from this viewpoint about the cooperation with the global south. We need to consider not relying on the systems that have functioned under the globalization economy thus far, but instead creating institutions and rules that adapt to the rapidly changing global situation. What we must now consider is how to engage with countries referred to as the global south from these perspectives. The Quad, which include India, along with Japan, the US, and Australia, is increasingly playing a significant role in areas closely related to security in the Indo-Pacific region, such as research and development on advanced technology, geopolitical connectivity, and cybersecurity. The relationship between Japan and ASEAN countries, which has primarily been economic, is also shifting toward more strategic perspective, such as maritime security cooperation and the transfer of defense-related equipment. The démarche by the United States and Japan toward African countries concerning critical minerals and rare earths should also be noted from this viewpoint. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Astanah, do you have any views on that economic coercion question and diversification?
First, it's very the unfortunate thing about Quad, and I'll just speak on that at the moment. The very unfortunate thing about Quad is it's playing out in a region where many of the countries that's in the middle of that geographic region is not part of Quad, doesn't believe in it, and feels that the only thing we'll get from it is the fallout from Quad. So it is seen with a huge amount of trepidation by the countries within that, which is the countries of Southeast Asia. So what I think a year or two after the announcement of the formation of Quad, what ASEAN did was to come up with our outlook, how ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific is on that region, etc. And what we did was we gave our reading of what it should be, which is to be very inclusive, rather than to try and exclude certain economies or certain countries in the region. Simply because ASEAN over more than 50 years have just seen the value of what inclusive and participatory involvement brings each of us. And this is something that it forms very much the DNA of the organization and countries in the region. So it's something that we keep on banging on about because we have seen the benefit of it, and we see what it is that if we don't have it, how very quickly all the economic gains that we've made over the years will absolutely just fritter away. Now, as for where we could see ourselves in a world that becomes more fragmented, and the bigger powers grow separately from each other rather than pulling together, is while we're too small, we are not in a position to influence that, but what we try to do is to make sure that we play a role important enough for these big powers, where they see the benefit of getting us and keeping us engaged, rather than finding that we are of no value and therefore it doesn't matter and we get pushed to the side. So because of that, ASEAN is very, very big on our economic relations with all our partners, our dialogue partners, our external partners, so that for these powers, we become quite an important and integral element in their economy as well, so that we get pulled along as well by each of these big powers, which is also a reason why ASEAN doesn't choose in choosing friends, that every power, every country, big or small, is a friend. So that's our approach to how we'd play it out.
Okay. Mike, do you have a perspective on this before I throw to the audience?
I mean, there's no one silver bullet here. This is going to be how do we sit down and think about what are the capabilities that each of our nations bring individually, but as well as collectively to address this problem. It's one of the reasons why you are seeing the development of some of these micro groups, so to speak. You're seeing the Quad, you're seeing Japan, South Korea, the United States, you're seeing AUKUS. You know, and now those aren't new phenomena. It's Five Eyes, NATO, the EU, ASEAN, the BRICS. Collective approaches to trying to deal with problems are a pretty common approach through the history of statecraft. So this isn't anything new. I think what you're seeing though is technology and the current geopolitical dynamic are driving many entities to think about, hey, what new and different relationships can we create over and above the structures we've used for a long time? That's why, to me, you're seeing some of these new relationships emerge, in part because I think that there's a sense that perhaps the large collective global organizations that we had traditionally relied on in the aftermath of the Second World War just aren't working quite as well as we had hoped that they would. And therefore, in light of that, even as we're trying to reform some of those organizations, I think there's been a realization by some nations, hey, we need to create some different structures, particularly focused on particular problem sets or particular challenges. I think that's going to be part of the challenges going forward. And I also think when we're thinking about resilience, we shouldn't just think about resilience from a purely domestic or our own nation perspective. I mean, for example, as an American, when I think about what should America's resilience strategy be, I think, look at our friends and allies around the world. They ought to be part of this strategy. AUKUS, to me, is a textbook example of this idea. Everybody focuses on Pillar 1, the nuclear submarine piece, but I would argue Pillar 2, the technology piece, in the long run, has the potential, to me, to have even greater impact. And I'm not trying to minimize or in any way say that the nuclear submarine piece isn't a valuable one. Look, as a naval officer, I would never say that. But I just think we need to think about this a little bit more broadly, and technology clearly is going to be a huge element of this going forward. It's why AUKUS created Pillar 2 in the first place, for example.
That's right. I think that's a really good point, and we probably shouldn't forget that these unilateral institutions have a long history. They're not a recent creation. I mean, Australia and Malaysia, for example, are both members of the five-power defence arrangement in Southeast Asia, which has been hugely beneficial to upholding security in our region for a long period of time. All right, I think it's time to go to questions from the audience. I've got lights in my face, so I can't see you too clearly, so please wildly gesticulate if you'd like to ask a question.
So just throw things
We
at
have one
them.
up there at the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this session. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler from the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. And I wanted to respond to your question, Shadow Minister, around how do we discourage actors from economic coercion. I would say one of the great ways you do it is you show resilience, as Australia has done over recent years, showing that this is ineffective and in fact counterproductive. We then have to think, though, what enabled Australia to be resilient. And I'm afraid I'm going to say here it wasn't allies and friends, it was a global trading system. And I think it's important we remember the benefits, the protective benefits, the security dividend for us of a global international trading system. So if I can commend a voice from the Deputy Secretary General reminding us of the costs of fragmentation, and that when we're thinking about our policy, we have to have both in mind, both economic security measures, but also what we need to do to support the protection for us of international global trade.
Yeah, I think that's a point very well made, Melissa. I think if you had have asked Australians at the start of that economic coercion campaign from our biggest trading partner what the impact would be, they probably wouldn't have guessed that the Productivity Commission would estimate later that it would be 0.1% of GDP. And that's not to underscore that there wasn't some serious damage to individual firms and sectors, but our overall economy was surprising and resilient. Any comments on that before we go to the audience?
Yeah, I'd only make one quick one. I'm not trying to minimize it, but remember, it's also your friends and allies who become advocates for that global trade system, who become big promoters of that global trade system, and who help Australia in its position in that global trade system. So it's the collective power, to me, of all of us working together that gets us where we need to be.
All right, any further questions? We'll also accept short statements that are designed to provoke conversation. Yes, we have another one over there.
Can I hold it or not? Good afternoon, Paul Tennant, HII. I just really welcome the panel's comments on how the question of economic resilience alters as you start to climb an escalation ladder towards conflict. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Who wants to jump in on that one?
I think concerning the climate change, the economic security issue is closely related. For example, we can deal with the European issue. After the start of the Russian invasion against Ukraine, the European Union accelerated the zero-emission program initiated by the European Commission, I think. But in leaving from the dependence on Russia, they accelerate the introduction of the sustainable energy. But it changed another aspect. The European country is dependent on the article produced by the PRC, like wind farm and EV battery and advanced motors, magnet, I think. Actually, European Union and the United States also changing the policy in order to produce such kind of article inside their own economic zone. Thank you.
Can I make one quick comment on it?
You can, of course.
My experience is that the greater you're moving along the cycle from competition to crisis to conflict, the tougher the economic piece gets to be. And what I mean by that is, it is interesting to me, there are more sanctions currently in effect in the world today than in any other time in the last 75 years. Now, why is that? Because increasingly you see this in the choices the US makes, you see this in the choices China makes. You saw this, for example, in the immediate response to the invasion of Ukraine. What was the US first action? Sanctions. We said, hey, look, we don't want to get into a conflict from a military perspective with the Russians, so what tools do we have available to us? So we went with economic dimension. You look at China and the United States, neither wants, I believe, a direct military conflict with each other. So each is turning to the economic dimension as a way to ratchet up pressure, as a way to preclude, hopefully, getting in to a military conflict. So it's interesting to me that we're in a world at the moment, I think, where the desire to not have military conflict is getting to the point where it's driving us to a much greater use of the economic tool, if you will, as a measure to cause pain and change behavior.
Is it effective?
Well, it certainly hasn't achieved the result that we wanted in Ukraine. It hasn't achieved, you look at the most heavily sanctioned nations in the world, Iran, North Korea, the Russians, and then there's a handful of smaller. And I would argue it hasn't achieved, I'm not going to say it hasn't had any impact, but they haven't really achieved the impact that we had hoped that they might.
Should we change tact?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Should we change tact? Since it hasn't really achieved what
Well, I
intended
think
goals?
that argues, number one, sanctions in and of themselves are not going to be sufficient. I'm not trying to argue they're not a tool of value, but all too often to me, it seems to be, hey, let's just throw some sanctions at this problem. And the reality is it doesn't seem to have achieved the desired changes in behavior that collectively we had hoped for. So I do think it argues that we both need to reassess. We need to really ask ourselves, why is that? Why have they not been as effective? Because the reality is, again, look at the Russians, look at what they're doing, the Russians with oil, you look at what the Iranians are doing, look at North Korea. Nations are finding ways to work around the sanctions that have been in place. And those workarounds seem to be having some measure of mitigation impact.
Yeah, I mean, we don't only sanction people to try and prevent or deter conflict. We sanction them because it would be morally unacceptable to participate in their conflict. All right, any questions on this side of the room? I want to make sure you give an opportunity over there.
Hi everyone, Senator and Admiral Rogers and the panel, great discussion. I'm Ravi, I'm a PhD student looking at cybersecurity. Admiral Rogers, I loved the fact that you referenced the colonial pipeline example at the start because it speaks to the risks to national resilience from concentration in the supply of physical goods and services. My question is with your former director NSA hat on, what is your view on the conflict between us being free market economies with minimal government intervention in economic activity versus concentrations in the supply of critical technology services? I'm thinking of how we allowed Change Healthcare to build up to the level it did in market share, CrowdStrike, or your other major incidents over the years involving heavily concentrated technology service providers. I was just wondering, how do you think we tackle this issue of concentration in technology services markets? Thank you.
So from my perspective, I would argue in the end, this is a discussion about risk. And it's to me, what areas in your economy or in your national security do you feel that there's some level of risk that's acceptable versus those areas where you think the level of risk is potentially so high, you need to go with a much greater level of government involvement, government oversight. You're not going to treat everything this way, but for example, if you take a look at Colonial Pipeline and energy, my takeaway from that was we not only need more resilience in terms of the ability to recover more quickly, but in some areas within critical infrastructure, we need to be thinking about greater redundancy. This idea of if we're down to single point failure, that's just not a good place for us to be. Now, in some areas you would say, but the price of failure is pretty low in terms of the risk, in terms of the outcome that the failure generates. In other areas, you'd say, wow, the price that we would have to pay because of the failure is pretty high and we ought to be willing to do it. It's one reason why if you look around the globe right now, you look at most nations' approach to cybersecurity, you see this in Australia, you see this in the United States, a heavy focus on cybersecurity through the prism of critical infrastructure as really the focus for, well, why should governments be taking greater regulatory oversight and a greater role in terms of dictating, if you will, investment and prioritization in cybersecurity? And again, to me, it's a risk discussion, and that's the way to handle this.
Any quick concluding thoughts from the panel before the red light starts flashing at me down here? If not, then can I thank you all very much for your participation in the conversation today, and please join me in thanking our panellists.